Every time Washington intervenes abroad, it relearns the same lesson it refuses to accept. Actions taken in one capital don't stay contained there. Power moves, markets respond, and consequences spread outward in directions no one fully controls. What we're seeing now is another example of that pattern, unfolding in real time. As the Venezuela operation moved deeper into its first week, a quiet shift began inside global oil markets, a shift that reveals why economic pressure campaigns so often end up undermining their own goals instead of achieving them. On paper, the plan looked straightforward. Apply pressure, disrupt exports, squeeze revenue, and force political change. And for a moment, it appeared to be working. Chinese refiners did exactly what Washington wanted them to do. They stopped buying Venezuelan crude. But here's the part that didn't make the headlines. They didn't stop buying sanctioned oil. They simply changed where they bought it from. Venezuelan barrels were replaced by Iranian ones. And with that substitution, the core weakness of sanctions strategy was exposed once again. Money doesn't respond to speeches or moral arguments, it responds to incentives. Capital flows toward efficiency, reliability, and profit. When one supply line becomes risky or inconvenient, another takes its place. What happened next wasn't ideological or political, it was mechanical. One disrupted route triggered the creation of another. The result was not isolation, but rerouting. To understand why this matters, you have to look past the official messaging. The Venezuela operation was never just about Caracas or Maduro. The real audience was thousands of miles away. It was Beijing. Venezuela mattered because it represented leverage over Chinese energy access, over pricing mechanisms, over the broader structure of global oil trade. The objective wasn't simply regime change, it was proof that the United States could still reshape markets through pressure alone. China's response didn't involve threats or troops. It involved spreadsheets. Buyers recalculated risk, cost, and availability, and then redirected their demand. That adjustment happened faster than policymakers anticipated, and it followed a pattern that's becoming increasingly common. Modern economic competition doesn't revolve around denial. It revolves around substitution. When one door closes, another opens, often leading somewhere policymakers didn't intend. That's why Washington couldn't afford to simply walk away. Venezuela became a proving ground. If pressure failed there, if oil kept moving, if buyers adapted, then the credibility of sanctions everywhere else would weaken. The message to rivals would be unmistakable. Endure long enough and the system adjusts in your favor. That's not just a problem for one administration. It's a threat to the entire framework of economic coercion that underpins American influence. So pressure intensified, blockades tightened, tankers were seized, confrontations escalated. And yet, even as Maduro was detained and exports were disrupted, the oil trade didn't stop. It evolved. That evolution is what really matters, because power isn't measured by how loudly pressure is applied, but by whether it changes outcomes. The heart of this shift lies with a group of buyers most people have never heard of, but who quietly shape global flows: China's independent refiners. Known in the industry as teapots, these firms operate on razor-thin margins. Their survival depends on access to deeply discounted crude. For years, Venezuelan oil fit that need perfectly. Heavy, high sulfur, cheap, and consistently available through shadow shipping networks, it became a staple input for these refiners. By last year, Venezuelan shipments to China amounted to hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. That volume wasn't dominant, but it was strategically important. The type of crude Venezuela produces yields large amounts of asphalt, a material critical to China's massive infrastructure build-out. This wasn't a casual trade relationship, it was economically functional. Then, enforcement tightened. Ports stopped loading for Asian destinations, seizures increased, risk rose overnight. The question wasn't whether Chinese refiners would stop buying, it was where they would go next. The answer was obvious to anyone looking at the numbers. Iran offered nearly identical crude qualities at nearly identical discounts, with fewer delivery disruptions. Russian barrels were also available. The economics lined up cleanly. This is where sanctions logic breaks down. The pressure didn't eliminate demand. It didn't even raise prices meaningfully. It simply shifted revenue from one sanctioned state to another. Venezuelan barrels disappeared from Chinese books, but Iranian ones filled the gap almost immediately. Same margins, same inputs, different beneficiary. What makes this outcome especially damaging is timing. When restrictions on Venezuela were briefly eased earlier, prices rose and discounts narrowed. That made Venezuelan crude less attractive compared to Iranian alternatives that remained heavily discounted. When pressure returned, buyers didn't hesitate. The math favored Iran, risk-adjusted returns favored Iran, reliability favored Iran. In trying to punish Caracas, Washington strengthened Tehran. That wasn't a side effect anyone publicly acknowledged, but it was the direct result of how global markets function. Sanctions didn't choke supply, they rearranged it. And the rearrangement favored one of America's most entrenched adversaries. That shift isn't abstract. Iranian oil revenue doesn't sit idle. It moves through networks tied to military and regional power projection. Increased exports translate into increased funding for forces and capabilities the United States is already confronting elsewhere. The irony is hard to miss. Policy designed to weaken adversaries ended up financing the very challenges American forces are now trying to contain. This isn't theory, it's arithmetic. More barrels sold means more cash. More cash means more capacity. And the cycle feeds itself. The United States finds itself intercepting weapons systems that its own economic strategy helped make affordable. That's not just inefficiency, it's strategic self-contradiction. And yet backing down isn't politically viable. Abandoning the operation would signal that pressure failed. It would invite replication elsewhere. So the strategy continues, even as its outcomes drift further from its stated goals. Venezuela stopped being about one country a long time ago. It became a referendum on whether economic power still functions the way Washington believes it does. Right now, the evidence is uncomfortable. Markets adjusted faster than enforcement. Buyers adapted faster than planners. And the system proved more flexible than the pressure applied to it. The wells didn't decide the outcome, the customers did. To see the scale of what changed, you have to follow the flow of money, not the headlines. Before the operation, the system was relatively simple. Venezuelan crude moved across oceans, Chinese refiners paid discounted prices, and revenue stayed largely within Caracas's control. However, inefficiently, it was managed. China secured heavy crude close to its needs, Venezuela secured cash flow, and the arrangement persisted despite years of pressure because it worked economically for both sides. After the operation, that circuit broke, but it didn't collapse. It rerouted. Venezuelan exports slowed, shipments became sporadic, and enforcement risks multiplied. Almost immediately, Iranian barrels began filling the gap. The destination didn't change, the demand didn't change. Only the origin did. Revenue that once landed in Caracas now landed in Tehran. China's access remained intact. The market preserved itself. This is the part Washington struggles to confront honestly. You can disrupt a supplier, but you can't erase demand. You can seize ships, but you can't force buyers to abandon profitability. Heavy crude is a technical requirement for certain refiners. Asphalt yield matters, sulfur content matters, price matters. None of those variables disappear because a government falls or a blockade tightens. The operation achieved a visible outcome. Maduro was removed from the equation, but the invisible objective, controlling flows, shaping incentives, preserving leverage, slipped away. The oil kept moving. The customers stayed supplied. The leverage evaporated. That gap between tactical success and strategic failure becomes even clearer when you look at what didn't happen next. American oil companies were supposed to arrive. That was the promise. Billions in investment, rapid reconstruction, production restored under friendly management, Venezuelan oil re-entering global markets under a new flag. Instead, nothing rushed in, no flood of capital, no immediate rebuilding, no rapid return to pre-collapse output. And that wasn't hesitation or politics, it was corporate reality. Oil majors don't invest on slogans, they invest on guarantees, legal certainty, political stability, contract enforcement, insurance coverage, access to financing, predictable regulatory frameworks. None of that exists in Venezuela right now. In a country emerging from intervention doesn't offer certainty, it offers risk. Ownership claims are contested. Future sanctions remain a possibility. Governments can change again. Contracts signed today can be challenged tomorrow. Insurers price conflict into premiums if they offer coverage at all. Banks hesitate. Boards delay. Shareholders demand caution. So while speeches promised transformation, companies waited. And waiting has consequences. Without immediate investment, production stays constrained. Without production, supply gaps persist. And as long as those gaps exist, other suppliers step in. Iran doesn't need speeches. It just needs ships that arrive on time. This is how political ambition collides with economic friction. Governments can remove leaders. They cannot compel corporations to gamble billions in unstable environments. The result is a prolonged transition period where promised benefits don't materialize and unintended effects harden into structure. At the same time, enforcement itself is becoming more aggressive. This isn't just about paperwork anymore. It's about ships shadowing ships, escorts appearing in contested waters, submarines being tracked, aircraft monitoring tankers across oceans. Economic pressure is no longer purely financial. It's increasingly physical. Every seizure carries risk. Every interception invites escalation. Trade enforcement is sliding closer to military confrontation, and that shift creates new instability layered on top of existing tensions. The oil market isn't just adapting economically, it's adjusting to a security environment that's growing more volatile by the month. While this plays out at sea, the diplomatic landscape is shifting on land. Latin American governments have been unusually vocal. Not fragmented statements, but coordinated opposition. The message has been consistent. Sovereignty matters, unilateral action carries consequences, and regional security shouldn't be dictated externally. This doesn't reverse the operation, but it changes the future. Support that was once assumed is now conditional. Neutrality is no longer passive. Countries aren't lining up behind Washington or Beijing. They're carving space for autonomy. And that autonomy limits how freely the United States can operate in its own hemisphere going forward. Europe's response has been cautious to the point of discomfort. Expressions of concern, warnings about precedent, appeals to international law, but no decisive action. Dependence on American security guarantees constrains how far European governments are willing to go. Criticism stays symbolic. Power dynamics remain unchanged. At the United Nations, familiar patterns repeat. Condemnations are issued, language is strong, outcomes are weak. Veto power neutralizes enforcement. Rules exist, but they apply unevenly. The lesson others absorb isn't about legality, it's about strength. If you have it, rules bend. If you don't, they bind. That lesson travels faster than any diplomatic cable. Countries watch, they adjust. They plan for resilience instead of compliance. They diversify trade. They reduce exposure. They seek alternatives to systems that can be turned against them. This isn't ideological rebellion. It's risk management. And those adjustments accumulate. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Payments move away from traditional channels. Settlements happen in different currencies. Barter replaces cash. Gold replaces transfers. None of these shifts collapse the system overnight, but together they weaken the foundations that once made pressure so effective. Inside the United States, the effects feel distant at first. Gas prices don't spike immediately. Markets don't panic. Life continues. But the costs are real, and they compound. Naval deployments cost money. Enforcement operations require funding. Insurance premiums rise when trade becomes dangerous. Volatility seeps into pricing. Planning becomes harder for businesses and households alike. More importantly, the privilege that underwrites American flexibility, cheap borrowing, persistent deficits, global trust in dollar systems erodes incrementally. Each workaround reduces dependence. Each alternative reduces leverage. Over time, the advantages narrow. That's the irony at the center of this story. The people funding these operations through taxes and indirect costs are told they're protecting national interests. Yet the observable outcome is that rivals gain ground, partners hesitate, and markets slip further beyond direct control. The question becomes unavoidable. If the objective was to reshape behavior, did it succeed? If the goal was to restrict adversaries, did it work? If the aim was to demonstrate dominance, what message did adaptation send instead? Because what the market demonstrated was not fear, but flexibility, not submission, but substitution. And that distinction defines whether power endures or fades. When you step back and add all of this together, the outcome becomes clearer and harder to avoid. The operation succeeded on its narrowest terms. A leader was removed. Control changed hands. A visible objective was achieved. But the broader mission was never just about one man or one government. It was about control over flows, influence over markets, and credibility in the use of economic power. On those terms, the results are far less convincing. Oil did not stop moving. It changed routes. Buyers did not retreat. They adjusted. China did not lose access to discounted crude. It preserved it. The market did what markets always do when pressure is applied unevenly. It adapted faster than policy could keep up. And in that adaptation, new winners emerged. Iran's position strengthened. Its exports increased. Its leverage grew. Revenue streams expanded, and those resources didn't vanish into abstraction. They translated into capability, into influence, into persistence. At the same time, Russia inserted itself more deeply into enforcement friction, escorting shipments, increasing the risk of confrontation, and embedding itself further into contested trade routes. Each layer added complexity and danger that didn't exist before. Meanwhile, regional relationships frayed. Latin American governments signaled resistance, not rebellion, but refusal to automatically align. That distinction matters. Automatic alignment is the foundation of easy power projection. Once it disappears, every future action becomes harder, slower, and more expensive. Diplomatic capital once spent doesn't regenerate quickly. U.S. companies stayed cautious. Capital stayed on the sidelines. Production remained disrupted. The promised rebound didn't arrive on schedule, and without it, the strategic vacuum persisted. That vacuum was filled by actors Washington wanted weakened, not empowered. The blockade itself proved porous. Tankers evaded tracking. Ownership structures shifted. Flags changed. Documentation adapted. Enforcement became a game of escalation rather than resolution. Each successful evasion encouraged the next. Each seizure raised the stakes. The system learned just as it always does. This is the defining feature of modern global markets. They are not static, they are networks. When one node is cut, flow reroutes through others. When one system is weaponized, alternatives emerge. Pressure accelerates innovation, not compliance. That reality clashes with a worldview shaped by an earlier era, when isolating a country meant isolating its economy. That era is gone. Today, isolation requires near-universal participation, and near-universal participation is increasingly impossible. Too many actors have incentives to defect, to arbitrage, to exploit the gaps pressure creates. The deeper cost of this misalignment isn't immediate failure, it's gradual erosion. Each unsuccessful pressure campaign teaches observers what doesn't work. Each workaround becomes a template. Each adaptation becomes institutional knowledge shared quietly among those most affected. Over time, that knowledge accumulates. Sanctions lose surprise, enforcement loses deterrence, pressure loses credibility, not because it stops being applied, but because it stops producing decisive outcomes. And that brings us back to the core question this operation raises. What does success look like in a system that no longer responds predictably to force? If removing a leader doesn't alter the underlying economic incentives, then what has actually changed? If markets continue functioning with different inputs, has leverage been preserved or surrendered? The uncomfortable answer is that power achieved visibility but lost subtlety. It demonstrated capacity for disruption but also revealed its limits. Those limits are now being studied closely by allies and adversaries alike. The world that emerges from this isn't one where American influence disappears. It's one where it competes more openly, more expensively, and with fewer automatic advantages. Economic unipolarity fades not in a dramatic collapse, but in a series of small adjustments that collectively reshape the landscape. Venezuela was never the endpoint. It was a stress test, and the test revealed fractures in sanctions, in alliances, in assumptions about how markets behave under pressure. Those fractures don't close easily. The operation continues. Ships still move. Forces remain deployed. Statements are issued. But the fundamental imbalance remains unresolved. Demand persists. Supply adapts. Revenue finds new paths. And influence disperses rather than concentrates. This is the paradox at the center of modern power. You can remove obstacles, but you can't command outcomes in a system designed to route around control. Markets don't submit. They adjust. And every adjustment redraws the map in ways that force policymakers to confront a harder truth. Force can change who governs. It cannot, by itself, change how global economics works. If the goal was to demonstrate dominance, the result was exposure. If the aim was to shape behavior, the outcome was substitution. And if the intention was to protect long-term interests, the consequences raise questions that don't disappear when the headlines move on. Because once the market learns it can adapt faster than enforcement can respond, that lesson doesn't unlearn itself. It spreads, it hardens, and it shapes every confrontation that follows. So the question isn't what happened in Venezuela. The question is what happens next, now that the limits are visible, the incentives are clear, and the system has already begun adjusting to a future where pressure no longer guarantees control.